Welcome to the Mitchell Center for Sustainability Solutions and our Sustainability Talk series. My name is David Hart. I'm the director of the Mitchell Center. So now it is my pleasure to welcome my friend and my colleague, Tony Sutton. The Mitchell Center was an early investor in Tony when he was working on indigenous food systems in collaboration with the Aroostook Band of the Maliseet as part of his master's degree. And Tony went on to build innovative collaborations with Passamaquoddy tribes as part of his Ph.D. research, which we'll be talking about today. For nearly 3 years, I've also had the pleasure and privilege of collaborating with Tony, who leads the course that we co-instruct, where students in this room or on the web are listening to and writing about these weekly talks. And Tony's a brilliant and passionate advocate when it comes to Wabanaki food systems, but he's also an extraordinary teacher and mentor, including a very generous mentor to me. So please welcome Dr. Tony Sutton.
All right, yeah, thank you for the introduction, and thank you all for joining me either in person or live, wherever you're at. Just to introduce myself a little bit more than David already did so well. I always like to tell a story with the class that's taught here. And it also sums up some of my experiences as a graduate student. And in 2010 was sort of the first idea I was even thinking about doing a PhD. And I think it was just my advisors who suggested, like, hey, go to the graduate expo and talk to some people. And so I did, because that's what graduate students do when you get advice. And I remember I said I was really interested in doing engaged work with indigenous communities that really values their vision for the future and centers it in the research design. And I was given a very blunt answer, and it was good luck. And I remember that it kind of stuck with me. And at the time, there wasn't a lot of places really doing that. I mean, it's 12 years ago, so some time has passed, but that's really not a lot of time. And Maine was one of those places. So I came here and I started doing that work. And as a social scientist, once I finished my PhD, a lot of that work is drawing from, the communication discipline, as well as being a Passamaquoddy person. I also have a strong interest that I'm not only studying the food systems, but, I'm trying to re-engage in those practices myself and sort of blend those two worlds within my work. And a lot of that work has been around food broadly, but more specifically lately is looking at sites of sustenance related to fisheries. So this is actually salmon falls, but just to conceptualize how Wabanaki people are thinking about food first, it's really about movement. And David Francis, a late Passamaquoddy historian, says it really well. And he says the seasons are organizing where and how people live. So food isn't regulated by a single space, but it's about movement between different spaces depending on what time of year it is. And again, Salmon Falls would be one of those places, which is the picture here on the right. And I know from listening to a lot of the Mitchell Center presentations, as well as just understanding what goes along, the topics that are relevant, fish passage is certainly one of them. So this image is one that I want to come back to repeatedly throughout, so we can kind of understand this idea of what rivers are teaching us about partnerships. Within this place, I'm also recognizing it's not just about food we're talking about, it's also values. So we're not just going to these places to fish, but it's also an expression of our values. And one of those is really illustrated well in this quote, but I'll summarize it for you. But the natural world is not unlike the social world. It can be maintained or broken by the ways in which one behaves. So again, we'll keep coming back to this site of sustenance because it's somewhere where this value is being expressed. And something that it's doing that I think is important for this conversation is it's bringing the natural world into that conversation, as a partner it's expressing itself in different ways. And just a couple pieces of literature I've been thinking with recently. I came back to Keith Basso's work talking about, he's an anthropologist, or was an anthropologist. And in this context, I was talking about ethnographers. So an ethnographer spends an extended period of time in a community, so that way can understand it from the community's perspective. And Basso is also saying that we have these conversations, but we're not thinking about the place that much. And more recently, Watts is kind of pushing that idea much more further. And it's really this idea of the land is speaking through us. So really trying to make the argument that these places are active within these sites of participation as well. So both of those ideas I'm going to come back to throughout the presentation as well. But if the land is speaking through us, then I thought I would bring back some of those voices within the site of this research. So we'll go all the way back to 1739. And again, I've kind of tried to bold and underline some of the important parts, but this is one of those voices that's speaking and advocating for these places all throughout Maine. And it's a very similar conversation to today. They're advocating for a fish passage, so that way they can have access to this food. And again, this was a long time ago, so let's go forward another 150 years. This is some context for this speech. So hunting and fishing tend to get lumped together, and the state will also break those things apart. But in this case, a Passamaquoddy person was being arrested and punished for hunting out of season. And within the trial, the state went so far to advocate that the Passamaquoddy no longer existed. And so therefore, they didn't have any hunting and fishing rights that protected this individual. So Lewis Mitchell, being an advocate, is speaking out against this and advocating again for their rights to access these sites of sustenance. And then again, very similar, a little bit more contemporary, very similar conversation. This is the Joint Tribal Council for the Passamaquoddy Nations wrote a letter to the state of Maine. And again, they're advocating for the same thing, fish passage to support their sustenance rights. So when I'm saying with gratitude, I'm recognizing that it's a privilege that I'm here to say the things that I'm doing. And I also, in that privilege, I recognize I'm not the expert. I consider, the community members are really the leaders who are driving this work. I wanted to bring these voices out because I recognize they haven't been allowed to participate within these spaces. So I want to take a minute to portage, just to clarify what a portage is, going back to this picture. This is a waterfall, so if I was canoeing up to this point, I'd have to get out and go around and find another place to put my boat in the water. And Pauling is talking about this idea in this paper on waterscape, says moving from one part of the water to another is actually a movement between knowledge systems. One way of thinking about what was below and another whole world that is above it. And similarly, McBride is actually using stylistically the term portage. So I'm kind of mimicking her style. And it's moving from one chapter to another chapter in her book. And what I liked about that portage is it has that same idea of different knowledge systems, but the portage is also being used to process some of what was learned in one section to another. So I'm going to do the same thing throughout this presentation. And that's also one way I'm trying to use the rivers to help guide my thinking through this. So as I approach this kind of title and question, what rivers can teach us about it, these are kind of like the key sections I'm going to go through. I'm going to go through some history related to this, some present day engagement. And by that, I mean my engagement with these sites of sustenance. And then I'll talk a little bit about fish passage and healing towards the end. So just to clarify what I mean by the vernacular, and I think it's a good way to describe how the impacts to Wabanaki sustenance have occurred through that time period we just looked at. So the vernacular is going to be more common to the community that it pertains to than the broader community around it. So when I see work that's occurring within like fish passage sites like this one, I understand that to all the Wabanaki people who are also listening. Well, only one, first of all, but two, to recognize this conversation isn't new to them. I'm recognizing that with all the partnerships and works going on within this site, it's important to bring out this question, like how sites of sustenance were developed, because it informs how these partnerships are transpiring and actually where they're occurring as well. So we need to bring out these histories that have been intentionally forgotten. So one of the early questions I was interested in my dissertation was like, what was kind of organizing all this stuff? And we're going to go way back into history to do that. And it really came out through the rivers, and specifically sites of sustenance were organizing conflict that was occurring. So if we're going back to when English settlement was occurring within Maine, they had a really hard time fighting Wabanaki people. And specifically, one of the reasons why is because we traveled so lightly on the land. We were able to move from sites of sustenance to gather resources versus the other type of warfare, which had to like bring everything with them as they were going. They were very slow and things like that. So, and this was actually a strategy they developed to target these sites of sustenance, because they recognized, again, our power was coming from being able to access these important places. And it's important to note that previous treaties didn't allow these types of military forts to be built, but they were built anyways. And specifically, as it says in this sign, and like Carol told me, I'm not going to walk away, but I can use my mouse. It says it here in the middle section. They targeted these areas. So the landing places or portages that we were looking at earlier, they targeted them, and they're very specific. It's not my argument that it's specific. It says so very clearly in their intentions when creating them, that they wanted to break up the hunting and fishing territory, so that way they could have access to that for access to resources and trade and things like that. And this strategy was effective. They used it on the Androscoggin, the Kennebec, and the Penobscot. The Schuylkill River between Maine and Canada is a little bit different because it's a little bit further north. But in terms of the Androscoggin, Kennebec, and Penobscot, they all kind of follow this similar history where those forts were used to displace Indigenous people from those areas. So that way, these forts could be built that supplied settlements. The most notable example of that is Brunswick. So let's see kind of how this pattern goes forward in history. After the Revolutionary War, they kind of lost their purpose having these forts, obviously. But since people were displaced from these areas, those waterfalls, which were often at sites of sustenance, they served another purpose. And they were where the first dams were built, so that way they could power sawmills. And this sort of extends this legacy of occupation in a lot of ways. So it's not only that people were displaced from these areas, but now you have industries that have set up in these areas too. And what this map is illustrating, this is courtesy of Sam Roy, and you can see this presentation that they did previously on this, but all the yellow dots represent dams, and they're also making an argument for the impact the culverts have for fish passage too, which is important. But I'm just here to illustrate that this image shows us that this pattern of utilizing waterfalls, which are commonly sites of sustenance, was a pattern that was proliferated throughout Maine. So to kind of portage for a second, if we're coming back to Wabanaki sustenance, these places like Salmon Falls, when they are dammed, it had and has a really big impact to being able to express those rights to fish and to have food within these areas. And like the second point, it's not just about fish. That's why I like, using that picture of my food. Well, I like taking pictures of food, but, brook trout and fiddleheads, those are like just the two foods that have been eaten together for centuries. So it's not just blocking those fish, but it's also impacting the plants that are within those areas, as well as the practices that exist within there and the values that are exhibited within those spaces. So if I'm thinking about what this river is teaching me in this kind of moment here, one realization I had when I was creating this presentation is that those places they're life-giving places. And I think that's an important thing to consider. And especially going back to that quote, that's why the values reflect that. These relationships can be maintained or broken depending on the ways in which one behaves. One thing I've been interested in more recently is actually just going to these places too. I can't go to hydroelectric dams because they have rules against that. But a lot of these forts are public access and they are still powerful sites of sustenance. So one of the things I've been doing is going to them, and I'm going to look at 3 different ones in terms of how I'm engaging with these places. And then at the end of those, I'll tell you kind of what I'm learning through all of those. So the first place is Kujanak, and it's at the head of tide on the Kennebec River. And Molly Obomswin writes a really good piece about Wabanaki perspectives on the Kennebec River restoration. And one of the ideas that really comes up in there that's interesting is Molly describes it as being the nucleus. And again, it's not just about fish. It was the center of governance, of trade, of so many social fabrics are all coming in together in this one spot. And again, that's what made it life-giving. And it's also why it was one of those places that would be targeted for this sort of putting a fort in there to displace people. So this is Fort Western, which is in Augusta. And the role of Fort Western was just to supply Fort Halifax, which we'll look at in a second, because these two are pretty close to each other on the river. And one of the things that it taught me when I was here, I remember I was walking around and all these places have been public access for the most part. So that's what I do. I just walk around, I take pictures of things. And I remember somebody came up to me and they said, "Are you paying for a tour? Because we don't allow free walking here." And I've worked at a museum, so I recognize what this person was doing. But at the same time, in the context of what I was going there to learn, I'm there to learn what these roles, or what the role of it, that this fort had in displacing, our Wabanaki relatives. So in a lot of ways, it's still kind of embodied the same idea, to have access to this place, you have to pay. And also the other thing that's very prevalent in the pictures is, in the presence of that, is this is the most reconstructed fort in Maine, to my knowledge. But you can really tell kind of this military kind of presence it has from the descriptions of cannons, which they include in their tours and what they can do to people, just to the walls of how high they are and how they're meant to keep people out. So let's go upriver to Fort Halifax. Just a couple pictures I took here that I think are interesting. The one on the left, that's that pattern I was talking about with forts and mills, and later the paper industry. So this is should be Waterville over here. But yeah, that's the old mill. So I'm standing on the grounds where the fort was, and I can see the mill in the background. So it's very much connected to that same idea I was talking about earlier. And then on the right, when I was standing there, it finally hit me. It's boom, right in my head. Because I saw the picnic tables and I was like, these places, again, they're not just about fish, but they're also about families. And when I showed this image to one of my classes one time, they were like, "Oh, I went to Winslow High School, and we used to go there and learn as a part of our class field trips." And I was like, "Oh yeah, that's another thing. These places are about teaching people too." This wasn't at this particular fort, but this is just a picture of a video of my son and I picking fiddleheads. So we'll watch it right there. Oh, can I see? Good job. Oh, or we'll watch it one more time. Right there. Oh, can I see? Good job. Yeah, so I mean, and the beauty of this video is that's the beauty of it, is like for families, you know, to be there learning, doing these things together. Again, these places are very, very powerful. Oh, we could have done another one. But we'll go to the last fort, Fort Pownal. That was the image I was referencing at the beginning. I've gone back to it a few times. It's kind of the first one that kind of keyed me into, you know, the power that these places have. And one thing I realized on the most recent trip there is that, well, all these places are still fishing places. And this one in particular, obviously is catering towards access to that through creating this boat landing for that. And another interesting experience was just being out there on the water, walking kind of along the edge here where this lighthouse is. I could see the schools of fish that were down there. So these are still fishing places. And this is at Fort Point State Park, which is in the Penobscot Bay, if you're unfamiliar with that region. And if you stand there long enough and look out at the water, you'll probably see the shipping boats go by as well. So this is still an important place for travel, for movement, for trade, for interactions between, you know, different groups of people. So again, just to kind of portage for a second to come back to this idea, like the you know, the ways these places are speaking through us. I think one idea to come back to is, remember David Francis is talking about these places are organizing where and how people live. And going through all those different examples, like Augusta is still the center of governance. Like that, just like things like that blow my mind. I don't know if there's that much pattern between governance and places and things like that, but still that it's used as this kind of like idea of being a nucleus is pretty fascinating. Also, the different layers of families are still occupying these places, travel is still occurring, fishing is still occurring in these places too. So again, they're powerful for very particular reasons. And at the same time, those reasons are still relevant today. So I want to come back to gratitude for a second. And recognizing that, again, the ways these places are communicating are through us. So this image on the bottom, this dam is scheduled to be decommissioned this year. And now we have other voices that are occupying this space as well. So this is a voice that's coming from the community that developed around this dam. And they want to make sure that the data reflects how the community is feeling about this and what their values are before they take this dam down. And they want that perspective to be heard. And that's important. But I also want to do exactly what their quote says and come back to what the community feels and values about that. So I want to bring back these voices again that haven't had the ability to participate in this space and come back. You know, we're thinking about fish passage in here, but all these people, as we've been learning through this presentation, they're advocating for fish passage to these places, but there's so much more than that. You know, they're the values, they're the families, it's governance, it's trade, it's all those things. But, you know, most importantly, it's fish passage, it's for food. So that's why I'm saying maybe we should think of like, move it from fish passage to food passage to kind of get at some of these voices who are, you know, advocating for these places for so long. I don't know if I'm fully convinced food passage is the right term or not, because I don't know if it fully expresses the relationship within that place. But I think that movement from that terminology opens up some conversations, because just because you have fish passage doesn't mean you have food passage. Because one, we have a legacy of contaminants that regulates how much fish we can eat. And again, that comes from the history of how these rivers have been used by those industries. But we also need to bring back those ideas of access and movement too, because food is not stationary from any of those individuals' perspectives. Food is also being able to move from place to place. So these are some ideas that I want to kind of finish out this presentation with. So kind of, again, this legacy of contaminants, you know, Dr. Darren Ranco and others worked on this assessment. And kind of one of the ideas that comes up with this is that, again, the state's regulation of these chemicals is inconsistent with, Wabanaki diets. And just for like some number purposes, I think the state says they allow like 25% of, diets to come from like sustenance fishing. That's what they're going to allow, which is weird to say that they have to allow it. But really the presence of these contaminants, it really makes it possible for one to eat either 1 to 4 fish a month, depending on what type of species is. So even by the own state's definition of sustenance, we're far below being able to meet that 25%. So this report kind of gets into that. And some of the stuff that I've been a little bit more involved with, and it feels like I've been talking for a while and I haven't talked about the solutions yet, but I just want you all to know that's intentional. That's a choice that I made because, again, I feel like people want to have these partnerships and they're eager to get into them. And at the same time, they have these very rich and deep histories that shape all the dynamics that have been occurring in these places. So like, how is this thinking actually useful? Well, looking at clamming, for instance, if a lot of these conversations in the broader clamming community, there's a lot of issues around access. There's a lot of shorefront being purchased right now. And what that's doing is it's not allowing clammers who are primarily non-Wabanaki to have access to clamming areas. And that's a big problem for them. And our work from the Maine Shellfish Learning Network hopefully helps support that form of access too. But in terms of like the histories we've talked about here, Wabanaki people have their own issues with access. So not only were colonial forts kind of displacing people from sites of sustenance like clamming, but also the state of Maine had the power to also order people to live on their reservation. So that means even if people chose to live in other coastal areas, the state could tell you to go back to their reservation when they wanted to. And that all feeds into these conversations around coastal access too. And if you're thinking about things like partnerships, it can kind of remove groups' abilities to participate within those conversations because of that history of displacement. Another one that's kind of like hitting both of this legacy of contaminants as well as this idea of restoring access. We've been doing some work with the Maine Indian Tribal State Commission, and that's a group of all the Wabanaki Nations. And really the role of that group is to make policy changes for the Settlement Act related to things like food. So they did a saltwater fisheries report, but they never did a freshwater fisheries report. And so that's a lot of after my dissertation, a lot of my work has been going towards doing a freshwater fisheries report, just so you have the context. But if we're thinking about, how we're telling people the story about Wabanaki sustenance, we have to understand that, one, it was strategically developed. It didn't occur the way it is now out of coincidence. So that's why that history is important. And then the other key part of this report is also bringing in that Wabanaki voice. How do we conceptualize sustenance and bringing that into the report so that way the state can understand their definition for sustenance is basically like one sentence. To paraphrase it, it's like anything that you're getting from the land or sea that's going on your table. There's no economics involved with that. It's very black and white. But for Wabanaki people, sustenance is a very embodied and complex term that encompasses many parts of our life. So that report will kind of encompass both that historical perspective, which I provided some insight about, as well as it'll engage with people who are sustenance practitioners in the present. Just to move towards healing, a couple more slides for you all. I'm not involved with any of these projects in particular, but I always just like to point out, you know, our leaders in healing these rivers are coming from our communities. The Aroostook Band of Micmac, they've been working on PFAs for quite a while because one of the lands that was returned back to them has been heavily contaminated with a lot of different toxins. And right now it's something that, you know, the broader Maine community is concerned with as well. But I think it's important to recognize that, you know, the Micmacs have been working on this issue for quite some time. The Maliseet, they're doing really great habitat restoration work on the Maduxnikeg because of that history that, again, we have of developing rivers. It wasn't just dams that they used to support the industry, it was also things like they'd have to blow up any rock structures because you wanted a uniform shaped river if you were going to put a bunch of logs down it. That's also really helpful for things like salmon so they can have places to spawn. So the Maliseet are doing projects to help bring back that habitat. The Penobscot Nation, you know, obviously the Penobscot River watershed and all the restoration that has occurred here is a really good example of how they can be leaders in that space. And also their just natural resource department is very actively involved in management of these waters, as well as, you know, also looking at those issues of pollutants that I was talking about as well. So they're really taking a strong approach to managing the water. And lastly, again, the Passamaquoddy Nations. Again, this picture is a dam that is going to be decommissioned. And, you know, they were key partners in advocating for the Schuylkill River to rebuild its fisheries. So again, I just want to point out, you know, the leaders in healing these waterways are coming from, you know, the communities who have likely had the least participation in their development. So let's kind of go back to, you know, this quote, because that's one thing that, you know, I want to leave you all with. And it's one thing that I think is relatable to anyone. And again, it's that idea that the natural world and the social world are not all that different. And they can be maintained or broken and by the ways in which one behaves. And I think right now, like through all that healing and things that we're seeing through people being involved in partnerships, that healing is occurring not just through fish passage or food passage, but also in the partnerships that work is occurring in as well. So lastly, I'll just do some thank yous, some woolly ones. It's Nudogagimik. That's just for all the Indigenous teachers that I've ever had. It seems like every place I've ever been, one just seems to walk into my world and share their knowledge with me. So thank you to all those teachers that I've had. Obviously the Mitchell Center for creating spaces for these types of partnerships to occur. And also the Maine Shellfish Learning Network team for going to these places with me and thinking with me. So thank you all as well.
Can we all give Tony a hand? He may not be able to hear us, but those of us that are sitting at our computers, Tony, what a terrific talk. What a great talk. Yes, everyone, if you could type your questions into the chat. We have a few already. Tony, you started out in this just so interesting way where you said that when you started on your graduate work, you were really interested in engaged work. That was what motivated you. And people said to you, well, lots of luck with that. What would your students now say after they've had a chance to learn from you?
What would they say about me?
No, what would they say about the whole idea of engaged research and whether, you know, you were sort of given the message that, oh, don't even think of doing that. And the question people are asking is sort of, how are you changing that message to students?
I think like two ways. I think one, just in like the course design and just making a space that that I see teaching as a collaborative space, and I want their voice to matter within both the design of the class itself, but also in the sharing of ideas, because I learn as much from them as they do from me. So trying to reflect that in the curriculum as much as possible, but also like, bringing in my own work, I think is helpful because it allows people to learn things a little bit differently. But I think it also just shows them, what this work can look like. Even with today, like I really wanted to create a space for that non-human presence to show how it's participating with that, because that's something that I hear from students that they're recognizing, but again, it's not having a space to do that. So I guess that's the other part is showing them that a lot of those ideas that they have can be possible. Yeah.
Very interesting. Very interesting. You talked about portage and in really interesting ways. And one of the key messages that you were giving to us is it's really about moving between knowledge systems, sort of upriver and downriver. And that's just such an interesting point. People found that a really interesting point. If we wanted to think about that more or learn more about that idea, do you have suggestions?
Yeah, I would say like go to some of these forts and just spend some time walking around. I was saying the Maine Shellfish Learning Network team came with me, and some of them are watching me, so thanks for coming out. But I remember when we were going out there, I'm gonna have to put Gabby on the spot. Says, she sees the world in a different way than I do because, she's trained as being an oceanographer. And yeah, oh gosh, no, I remember we were standing out on the Kennebec River, and the way that she's trained is she was able to see how the water patterns were circulating within that area, and those water patterns are important for one, where you're fishing, but also where you're traveling. And I wouldn't have had that idea by myself, and I wouldn't have had any of the ideas I had in this talk if I hadn't have gone to those places. So maybe that's it. You go to these places and bring a friend, and also just be there, be present, and see like what is that experience like, and then go back to them, because building a relationship occurs through repetitions, not necessarily a single one. But Fort Point State Park is pretty close to here too, so you could go visit that one. It's pretty accessible. But yeah, walk around and be in these places.
Very interesting. You talked about what rivers can teach us about partnerships. Do you have some messages to us about what we should go home tonight and think about in terms of that very important idea?
Yeah, that's remember, it's not just about fish passage, it's about food passage, because if you can't eat the fish, that's an important point. But it's also an opening. It's not just something that should bring people down. It just lets us know that, one, the work is ongoing, it's long term, it's going to take a while. But I think it's important to bring that conversation in there, because it fully illustrates all the partners in that space. If the natural world and the social world are connected, then it can't just be about the ecological part of that.
Yeah. And what do you feel is the biggest challenge to engaging people in listening to rivers differently than what they're used to doing? Do you have any thoughts about that?
Tons. I think it's also to recognize that histories of displacement are not just about who can participate in places, but what knowledge can exist in those places too. So I think this idea that these places are speaking through us, that's a very, very old idea. And it's just an idea that hasn't been allowed to exist within these spaces. And I think that is a challenge, And it's one that, Indigenous scholars and non-Indigenous people come up with is just this idea that, certain forms of knowledge are privileged in this space and other ones aren't. And just to clarify, by Indigenous scholars, I mean that as a broad term, from the people who are coming from our communities, to the people who are in these spaces, to the people who are thinking about these issues. And again, for those knowledge systems to be able to participate fully, I think that's the challenge that people are currently working through.
Very, very interesting.
Hey, Linda, can you hear me?
Uh-huh. I can.
Great. Can we do a question from the room next?
Yeah. And then we'll ask some from the world.
Can you hear me? Okay. Oh, that's loud. So thank you very much for the talk. Kind of within the context of, us being in the sustainable or the Center for Sustainability Solutions. I think the concept of the Sustainable Development Goals that were developed some time ago, it's very interesting. And one of the difficulties with that is establishing those between, say, different countries, right? How have you run into similar problems or seen similar problems between, say, the Passamaquoddy and the state of Maine? Or what guidance would you have for finding solutions that fit everybody?
Yeah. I think solutions that fit everybody. In the context of this work, I think one thing I've been thinking about that's kind of related to that question is the difference in like how we're conceptualizing the outcomes of that. So for instance, I think in Indigenous communities, if we're to engage within them and find these commonalities, you really have to have a strong relationship built within that community. And in terms of like me being an academic trying to progress through the system, I don't get credit for the relationships that I build with people, even if they're long going. Part of my dissertation was spending a year building relationships with the community that I wanted to work with, so I could find those common places. But that year doesn't count for anything. So instead I wrote a dissertation about it, but that, I think, yeah. So I do think that's part of the answer. It's building relationships and understanding that sustainability solutions, whatever that solution is, takes time. And I think that's why rooting it in those relationships is useful, because you're going to spend a lot of time with that person, spend a lot of time thinking with them. If your knowledge is being contested, then you're going to spend a lot of time processing that emotions that come along with that too. So I think to get to those solutions, you have to start with, those genuine relationships.
David, can I go ahead and ask another?
You bet.
So this one's, again, back to what we learned from rivers. And it is, do you think that your learning would be different if you were traveling on the river rather than moving on the land?
Absolutely. Yeah. And I'm not a very good canoeer because I grew up in Oregon, so I kind of really grew up separate from my culture in a lot of ways. But yeah, I think that would be another step that would add a lot of richness to how I'm thinking about it, is to get on this water and to paddle and to feel its movement and where it directs me. Yeah, I think that would be a really rich layer of knowledge to add to this.
Great. Now, the next question is a long one. So let me see if I can read it to you. It's an important one. I see lots of connections between Tony's engaged research and what I'm working on with Penobscot Nation language carriers and storytellers. Penobscot stories contain lots of evidence of Penobscot stewardship of the river fish, as well as deep family relationship with many different kinds of riverine fauna. After Akala Pima released all the water of the Penobscot River, the story says that many thirsty people jumped in the water and continued to live in it. Also, Glasgoby, as a child, invented a fish weir, but his grandma Woodchuck had to get him to turn some of them loose so people in the future would still have fish. Sorry for my mispronunciations, but Tony, thoughts? Help us think about that.
Yeah, I think when I was thinking about this presentation, I think when I first started, I was also thinking about having a stronger connection to some of the stories we tell. And that's to that point you were asking me earlier, Linda, about like challenges. And, you know, I said like our knowledge being fully represented, and stories I think are a good place from that. Like the one that you just shared, it still had that same value that I was talking about earlier, you know, like maintaining those relationships. And that's reflected in people's fishing habits too. So like using these stories as ways to process these things that are occurring are very useful. And once when I eventually publish this stuff, I think thinking through that with a story is probably how I will do that, because it has one advantage, as John Daigle mentions in his article that uses storytelling, is that one, it can process what's happening in the presence, but it also offers us a pathway to healing. So it's not just some story that has these historic origins, but it's something that's very contemporary and can be used to help us, again, process things. Because I think sometimes we have, you know, Indigenous histories, it's just like this onslaught of not fun things that have happened. And we don't offer that opportunity for healing. But I think, you know, bringing back our stories into those spaces is a nice way to, again, bring back that healing and that processing and stuff.
People, thank you, Tony. People are really eager to follow up on what you've talked about. And another question is, do you recommend any research guides for engaging with tribal communities in so-called Maine?
Research guides, like how to?
Yeah.
I think it would be back to Griffith's question earlier about, you know, like how do you actually do this stuff? And again, it starts with, I think, those relationships and actually creating those. I don't know if there's a clear path on how to do that. But I think a good place is to always start with the learning that hasn't occurred. And as I've been a teacher at, you know, instructor at UMaine for a long time, I just recognize that, you know, a lot of the students I have different understandings of, you know, Wabanaki relationships. And that's kind of one thing that I was hoping to also communicate through the presentation, is I didn't focus a lot on solutions because there's a lot to unpack that shape both the ecological and social space. So I think if I was to write a how-to, it would start with digging up, you know, those histories of those places that you want to work in. So that way you're a little bit more familiar with it before you start, you know, engaging with people.
Very, very helpful. Another person wrote, I agree, Tony, the knowledge surfaces through us just from being in these places, that knowledge is power, and it has been silenced for a very long time. Thank you for reminding us that knowledge never, oops, I'm having trouble reading this, never goes away. Tony, if people wanted to, this will be a really weird question, if people wanted to follow you around to learn from you, how could they do that? How could they learn more from you? Are there open things that you do? Are there classes that everyone should sign up for? Should they join the Maine Seafood Network as volunteers, what should they do?
Oh man, to follow me around. Wow. It's a good one. In a good way. Yeah, I mean, I think I'm just going to reiterate something I said earlier because I think it is important. Like the things that I'm doing, you know, I'm creating relationships with places as well as with communities. So, you know, that requires me going to places, and I'm obviously going to those places to do things like, you know, pick fiddleheads and to learn about plants and other things that are growing in those places. So if you are following me around, I think there's just endless opportunities for you to do that within this area that people just don't bother to look at. So, you know, go to those spaces. And then also, I think the best advice I ever had from, again, you know, being a graduate student and doing things that my advisors tell me to do was do some reading and then engage in the doing. And I remember once I started integrating both of those together, it really helped open up my thinking in a lot of ways. So, you know, spend some time in the library. Jen Bonet put together an exhaustive resource on, you know, Wabanaki authors talking about just a plethora of different issues. So, you know, read about them and then go engage with them and, you know, link those two knowledge systems together. And I think that's really, you know, what you would learn if you were following me around.
That is such a timely response, because another question, and this one is from Corvallis, Oregon.
Oh.
I wonder if Tony has some suggestions about good readings about the multiple knowledge systems he mentions.
There you go. And I have friends from Corvallis, Oregon too, so that's great. Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't know the exact library guide, but yeah, Fogler Library has a great collection of all kinds of different histories. And I think another source of this history too is the, seems like towns everywhere have these just histories about their towns, and there's always little nuggets of information, but because this stuff has been intentionally forgotten, it's not always compiled in these nice and neat places. So sometimes, you know, looking at like I don't know, town history can have these things, little tidbits for you to learn about too. So
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Can I, we're about done. Could I do the last question that builds off this one?
Can I say one that's a thank you, and then you can do the question? This is the thank you. Thank you so much for creating space for this sharing and collaborative healing. You are such a gift to this community. Okay, David.
Well, I won't beat that one, but so speaking as a white settler colonist who can be pretty oblivious about the places that I am in, and lately I've taken to hiking up the side to the top of a mountain that the place names I usually find out it's called Mount Waldo, but, and I'm going to blow the pronunciation, but Kanapsatnek, which makes a lot more sense to me because it says steep rocky mountain, and I've been known to fall on my way up and down the mountain. So how, like Fort Pownell, I've been there and I don't even, like, you've opened my eyes to things that I'll look at it differently now. But do you have any guidance for us? Like, I want to go fiddlehead with you and Dawson if I can sometime, but do you have any advice about how we could open our minds and our hearts to this, given that this isn't our land?
Oh, that's a good question. I'll say, while you were talking, like how I can engage in these places, I think it's important to note I didn't find fiddleheads because I was going to look for them. I was actually trying to fish for brook trout. I just failed. And I think that's also, you know, something that, you know, they say, at least within our language, that, you know, our humor comes out, you know, in the language. And And that's how I kind of took that moment. Is it was something that I wasn't intentionally looking for, is something that the land was teaching me, and to be open to that. And again, I think that occurs, like going back to Keith Basso in the beginning. If ethnographers are expending extended periods of time so they can see a community from the social perspective, then you can do the same thing with the land. So as you return back to those places, and I know you paddle on the Penobscot over and over. So I guess that's the message, is not to be going for a certain thing, but to be open to when that thing presents itself.
So I think we're at time, but boy, we could keep this conversation going. And one good piece of news is for some of you who signed up to be down the hall with Tony in room 111, I'm going down there too to listen, and people will join virtually. But Tony, what a great talk. Thanks for opening our mind.
Thank you.